Part 1. The creek runs red. They destroyed Silver Run. That magnificent creek had flowed crystal clear through my property since 1750. When my ancestors first settled this land, now the water ran the color of rust, thick with chemicals that made my eyes burn just standing on the bank. Hundreds of fish floated belly up, their silver scales catching the morning sun like scattered coins. The chemical stench was overwhelming, sharp and acrid, burning my throat with every breath, and standing there, watching everything I loved die in real time, I knew exactly who did this. Victorious, president of Sunset Harbor Estates Homeowners Association, former corporate lawyer, current dictator of 873 homes, worth millions each. The woman who'd spent the last year trying to force me off land my family had owned for over 270 years, and she had no idea that destroying my creek meant poisoning every single one of her precious neighbors. Have you ever had someone so convinced of their own importance that they'd commit a felony just to prove a point? Tell me where you're watching from, and if you've dealt with HOA nightmares, drop your story below. Because this one's about to get absolutely wild. My name's Thomas Rivera. And at 52 years old, I never imagined I'd be at war with a woman who probably spends more on her monthly salon visits than most families spend on groceries. I'm a retired search and rescue diver turned kayak tour guide here in Riverside Springs, Florida. The kind of guy who believes in hard work, good fishing, and people minding their own business. My 15-acre property sits right on Silver Run Creek, a spring-fed waterway that's been in my family since before Florida became a state. We're talking about land deeded in 1752, back when this area was still Spanish territory and people actually respected property rights. Every morning, I walk the same pine needle path my great-great-grandfather carved out. The sandy soil crunches under my boots, still cool from the night air. Spanish moss hangs from ancient oak trees, swaying in the breeze that carries the smell of salt water and wild jasmine. The creek banks are lined with cypress knees jutting up like nature's sculptures. Herons fish in the shallows. Otters play in the deeper pools. And for 273 years, this place has been pure paradise. The sound of water moving over limestone rocks is better than any meditation app. And the sight of sunrise turning the creek surface to liquid gold never gets old. Then, the developers arrived. 20 years ago, they bought up everything around me and built Sunset Harbor Estates, 873 McMansions, starting at $750,000 each. Mediterranean-style homes with 3-car garages, community pools, tennis courts, and an HOA board that thinks they're running a small country. The developers offered me $4.5 million to sell, wanted my creek frontage for their luxury amenity package. I told them they could take their money and build a yacht club in the Atlantic Ocean. Most of the new residents were decent people. Retirees from up north, young families working in Tampa, professionals who waved when they jogged past my property. They'd stop to ask about the fishing or comment on how beautiful the creek looked. Normal neighborly behavior. But then Victoria Sterling moved in 3 years ago, and everything went straight to hell. Picture this. 45 years old, drives a pearl-white Mercedes that gets detailed weekly, carries a leather briefcase to neighborhood barbecues like she's heading into court. She talks in legal speak, even when discussing the weather. Throws around terms like regulatory compliance and aesthetic optimization standards. The kind of person who probably has a color-coded calendar for leisure activities. Her husband Jonathan is a real estate developer, which explains a lot about her entitlement issues. They paid $1.2 million for their waterfront property, which apparently gave her the right to dictate how everyone else should live. Victoria appointed herself HOA president within 4 months of moving in. Her campaign promise was enhancing property values through strict compliance protocols, which is fancy talk for making everyone miserable until they conform to her suburban dystopia vision. She immediately launched an audit of all properties within view of the development. And guess who her primary target was? The old Florida cracker house with the fishing dock and kayak tours. Her opening move came 5 months after she took office. Certified letter, legal letterhead, delivered by a courier who looked embarrassed to be there. My commercial kayak activities were apparently creating safety hazards and disturbing the peaceful enjoyment of waterfront properties. This woman paid $1.2 million for a house overlooking my creek, and suddenly decided that watching me run kayak tours was somehow ruining her investment. The letter demanded I cease all commercial activities immediately or face legal action. The legal threats escalated faster than a Florida thunderstorm. Victoria claimed my dock violated county setback requirements, even though it had been permitted and inspected in 19. She filed complaints about noise pollution from my kayak groups, despite the fact that paddling is literally one of the quietest activities possible. She even tried to claim my property created mosquito breeding grounds that threatened public health, which would have been hilarious if it wasn't so insulting. I called my attorney, Maria Santos, who'd helped my father defend this property twice before. She laughed so hard I thought she'd drop the phone. Thomas, your property predates the HOA by 250 years. Their covenants and restrictions cannot be applied retroactively to your land. She's threatening you with laws that literally don't exist for your situation. Legal knowledge. If your property existed before an HOA was established, their rules generally cannot be enforced on your land unless you voluntarily agree to join. Your original deed and its date are your legal shield against retroactive regulations. When intimidation tactics failed, Victoria filed a formal complaint with Monroe County claiming I was operating an unlicensed commercial facility. The poor county inspector drove out, looked at my permits that dated back 35 years, checked my business license, reviewed my insurance documentation, and apologized for wasting both our time. I could see him shaking his head as he drove away. He'd seen this type of HOA harassment before. That's when Victoria revealed what she was really capable of. Every morning, I'd head down to the creek at 6 o'clock to prepare for my kayak tours. The early light on the water is magical, and getting everything ready before clients arrived was part of my routine. Suddenly, Victoria needed emergency tree removal. Chainsaws screaming, wood chippers grinding, diesel trucks rumbling, all positioned right along her property line. The racket would start at exactly 6:05 every single morning, and continue until my clients showed up, at which point everything would mysteriously shut down. The timing was too perfect to be coincidental. The diesel exhaust would drift across my creek, mixing with jasmine and turning my peaceful morning routine into something that smelled like a construction site. Her landscaping crew was getting more overtime in 2 months than they'd probably seen all year. All because one woman couldn't stand watching someone run a legitimate business on their own land. But I kept operating my kayak tours. Some principles are worth defending, even against suburban tyrants with too much money and too little common sense. My clients loved the natural beauty of Silver Run Creek. Families came to see the wildlife. Nature photographers captured herons and eagles. Couples celebrated anniversaries, paddling through old-growth cypress forests. This was my livelihood and my heritage, and I wasn't about to let some HOA dictator take it away. I had no idea that Victoria was just warming up, and I definitely didn't know she was unhinged enough to commit environmental terrorism to get her way. You know what's worse than a lawyer with a grudge? A lawyer with a grudge who weaponizes every government agency she can find. 2 weeks after the county inspector confirmed all my permits were valid, Victoria launched a full-scale bureaucratic assault on my property that would have impressed a military strategist. First came the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. An inspector showed up claiming they needed to investigate potential disruption to manatee migration patterns caused by my kayak tours. This woman convinced a state agency that me guiding tourists was interfering with manatees. The inspector spent 6 hours taking samples and found nothing wrong. Next arrived the EPA representative, suited up like investigating a nuclear spill. Apparently my creek usage might create environmental hazards threatening the watershed. County Health showed up Thursday, Code Enforcement Friday. By week's end, I had more government cards than a lobbyist. Each inspector found nothing wrong. My permits were valid. My business legitimate. But the harassment costs me time and stress. While Victoria played puppet master with agencies, she filed complaints everywhere. Better Business Bureau for unfair practices. Chamber of Commerce for improper membership. She even tried canceling my insurance, claiming I was Every accusation was fabricated, but each required time to defend. But bureaucratic harassment creates paper trails that work both ways. Every inspector left with positive reports. Every agency found her complaints baseless, and civil servants remembered who wasted their time. Teresa Martinez became my unexpected ally. She was a 65-year-old retired county clerk who still volunteered at the courthouse. Over coffee that tasted like justice with extra cream, she dropped a bombshell that made my head spin. Thomas, that entire subdivision was built on protected wetlands. The developer got permits by promising to preserve all natural water features permanently. It's federal law that binds every property owner there. The implications hit me like a rogue wave. If the development was bound by wetland preservation requirements, then any activity that damaged the natural water system would be a federal violation. Ande Ikenu. Victoria's landscaping contractors had been dumping grass clippings and chemical-soaked debris directly into my creek for months. I'd seen them do it, but hadn't thought much about it at the time. Property law nugget. Development permits often contain perpetual preservation clauses that legally bind all future property owners. Violating these environmental restrictions can trigger massive federal penalties and potential criminal charges. I spent the next 3 weekends playing environmental detective, armed with a camera, a GPS device, and patience I didn't know I had. I documented everything. Every Saturday morning at dawn, I'd position myself in the tree line with a view of the creek. The rough bark of pine trees pressed against my back as I waited, the smell of damp earth and morning dew mixed with diesel exhaust when Victoria's crew arrived. 3rd Saturday in a row, I captured them red-handed. The landscaping crew dumped organic waste straight into Silver Run Creek, the splash echoing across the still morning air. My photos were perfect. Time-stamped, high-resolution evidence of environmental violations happening in broad daylight, but the real goldmine came when I ran their business license through the state database. Coastal Landscape Management LLC was 45% owned by Jonathan Sterling, Victoria's husband. The same real estate developer who'd helped build Sunset Harbor Estates. Victoria wasn't just hiring random contractors to harass me with noise. She was using her husband's company to dump environmental waste into federally protected wetlands, all while filing complaints about my supposedly harmful kayak tours. The EPA doesn't just appreciate environmental violations with photographic evidence. They absolutely worship them when they're tied to harassment campaigns and property disputes. I filed my formal complaint on Monday morning with documentation that would make a prosecutor weep with joy. By Wednesday, Coastal Landscape Management was under federal investigation. By Friday, Jonathan Sterling had lost 3 municipal contracts worth over $200,000. Turns out, when you're dumping organic waste in protected wet, cities suddenly don't want you maintaining their public parks. Who could have predicted that? The sound of Victoria's perfectly controlled world starting to crack was sweeter than wind chimes on a summer afternoon. But if I thought environmental violations would humble her, I was about to discover just how catastrophically wrong one person could be. Nothing makes a desperate person more dangerous than watching their spouse's business empire crumble because of their personal vendetta. And Victoria Sterling was about to prove she'd rather poison an entire neighborhood than admit defeat. The morning I discovered the water treatment company's business card tucked under my truck's windshield wiper, I knew we'd crossed from legal warfare into something much darker. The card smelled faintly of chlorine and desperation. Industrial Water Solutions, Commercial Creek and Pond Management. Environmental terrorism was apparently Victoria's next strategic move, but she made one catastrophic miscalculation. Victoria had no idea that Silver Run Creek was the sole source of drinking water for every single home in Sunset Harbor Estates, and she was about to find out the hard way. That business card wasn't just a threat, it was evidence of premeditation. I photographed it, documented where I found it, and added it to my growing file of Victoria's harassment. My attorney Maria took one look at it and her expression shifted from concern to predatory. Thomas, if she follows through with this, she's entering criminal territory. While I was building my legal defense, Victoria was researching industrial water treatment with single-minded focus. She'd found Industrial Water Solutions, a commercial operation specializing in aggressive creek management, using chemicals strong enough to sterilize entire ecosystems. The owner, Derek Paulson, would later testify that Victoria called claiming to represent the HOA board, describing a dangerous algae bloom threatening property values. Derek believed her because she was convincing. She had legal credentials and corporate authority. He agreed to midnight application of industrial copper sulfate treatment, $3,800 in cash for what she called emergency environmental intervention. What Derek didn't know was that Silver Run Creek had no algae problem. The spring-fed water was crystal clear and supported thriving ecosystems. The irony would be devastating. Victoria was about to poison the water source, feeding every faucet in her gated community. 873 families drinking industrial chemicals because one woman couldn't tolerate her neighbor's kayak tours. The scale of her mistake would be unprecedented. I didn't know any of this yet. That evening, I sat on my dock watching sunset turn the creek to flowing gold. Mullet jumped in shallows. A heron stalked the far bank. My grandfather had taught me to kayak here when I was 6. My father continued the family tradition of creek stewardship. Now it was my turn to defend this place. Little did I know that my defense would shift from property rights to environmental catastrophe. Part 2. The Water Runs Poison. I came home from a weekend trip to find my world had ended. The smell hit me before I even got out of my truck. Sharp chemical stench that burned my nostrils and made my eyes water. Silver Run Creek had turned an unnatural blue-green color, like antifreeze mixed with death. Fish floated everywhere. Hundreds of them. Maybe thousands. Mullet, bass, sunfish, catfish, an entire ecosystem murdered overnight. I ran to the creek bank, my boots sliding on the sandy slope. The water that had run crystal clear for centuries now looked toxic, viscous almost. Dead fish covered the surface, like a carpet of scales and fins. The smell was overwhelming. Chemicals mixed with decay. My stomach turned as I knelt by the water's edge. This wasn't natural. This was deliberate. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone. The screen blurred through tears. I didn't know I was crying. This creek had been in my family for 273 years. My ancestors had protected it. My grandfather had taught me to respect it. My father had defended it. And now someone had killed it in a single night. I called Monroe County Environmental Emergency Services. The operator's voice shifted from routine to alarmed as I described what I was seeing. Don't touch the water, keep pets away. Don't disturb anything. We're sending a hazmat team immediately. Officer James Patterson arrived 30 minutes later with water analysis equipment that looked like it belonged on a space station. He was a veteran environmental investigator, 20 years dealing with illegal dumping and contamination. But even he looked shocked as he surveyed the carnage. The test strips he dipped in the creek turned colors that shouldn't exist in nature. Deep purples and sickly greens that made my skin crawl. Industrial copper sulfate poisoning, he said, his voice tight with professional anger. Extreme concentration. Whoever did this didn't just kill your fish. They sterilized the entire creek ecosystem for minimum to 2-3 years. This is felony environmental destruction. Possibly federal terrorism charges. Environmental law. Nugget. Illegal dumping of industrial chemicals on private property constitutes felony destruction in most states and triggers federal criminal charges. Penalties include 5 to 10 years in prison and fines up to $250,000 per violation. Patterson wasn't just documenting a crime scene. He was building a federal case. While I stood there, trying not to vomit from the smell, he was reviewing security footage from neighbors' doorbell cameras. Modern technology is beautiful when it catches criminals and Victoria's environmental terrorism was about to be captured in 4K resolution. The video was crystal clear. A white cargo van with Industrial Water Solutions printed on the side arrived at 2:23 in the morning. 2 figures in protective suits emerged and spent the next 18 minutes dumping chemicals directly into Silver Run Creek. The timestamp showed they finished at 2:41 and drove away like nothing happened. 18 minutes to destroy 2 centuries of family heritage. Patterson handed me a printed screenshot. Thomas, this footage will convict whoever ordered this. We've got the company name, vehicle plates, and visual evidence of the dumping, plus your water samples showed contamination levels that prove intent to cause maximum damage. This wasn't an accident. This was calculated environmental assault. I sat on my dock that evening, surrounded by death. The wooden planks felt cold and unfamiliar under me. No bird sounds, no fish jumping. No otter family is playing in the current. Just silence and chemical smell and the gentle lapping of poisoned water against the bank. My wife Rachel found me there after sunset, and we cried together for what we'd lost. But grief has a way of sharpening focus. As we started the heartbreaking task of cleaning up dead fish, filling garbage bag after garbage bag with Victoria's victims, my mind started making connections. I'd installed solar panels on dozens of homes in Sunset Harbor estates over the years. I knew their utility systems intimately. I knew where their water came from. Every single house in that subdivision used well water pumped from the underground aquifer system. The same aquifer that Silver Run Creek feeds directly into. The same limestone channels that connect my creek to their water supply. The same geological formation that meant whatever chemicals Victoria dumped in my creek would flow straight into 873 unsuspecting homes. Rachel stopped mid-motion, a garbage bag hanging from her hands. Thomas, if the chemicals flow through the aquifer, then Victoria didn't just poison my creek. I finished. She poisoned her entire neighborhood's drinking water. Every faucet, every shower, every swimming pool. The realization was stunning. Victoria Sterling, in her single-minded determination to destroy my kayak business, had just contaminated the water supply for nearly 1,000 families, including her own. The woman who'd spent a year complaining about my unsightly commercial activities had turned her perfect gated community into a toxic waste site. The irony would have been hilarious if it wasn't so catastrophic. I had my water tested first thing Monday morning by an independent environmental lab. The results came back 48 hours later and made my blood run cold. Copper sulfate levels 4 times higher than EPA safe drinking standards. Contamination spreading through the limestone aquifer at approximately 10 feet per day, estimated to reach residential wells within 6 to 8 weeks. The technical report used phrases like acute toxicity risk and potential neurological damage in children. It talked about bioaccumulation in tissues and long-term health consequences. This wasn't just about dead fish anymore. This was about families drinking poison, kids bathing in contaminated water, cooking with chemicals that could cause liver damage. I called Maria Santos immediately. My attorney listened to everything and then went silent for a long moment. "Thomas," she finally said, her voice carefully controlled, "this isn't a property dispute anymore. This is public health emergency. Federal authorities will be very interested in this." But I was already thinking 3 steps ahead. Victoria had spent months weaponizing government agencies against me. Now it was time to return the favor. Wheat interest. And I had something she didn't know about yet. Something that would shift the entire power dynamic so dramatically that her lawyer brain wouldn't see it coming until it was too late. You know what's interesting about old property deeds? They contain information that modern developers completely overlook. Water rights, mineral rights, easements, and protections that predate modern zoning laws by centuries. While Victoria was busy trying to force me off my land through harassment and terrorism, I was spending quiet hours in the county courthouse basement researching exactly what my family owned. That courthouse basement smells like dust, old paper, and forgotten history. Fluorescent lights buzz overhead like dying insects. Filing cabinets stretch from floor to ceiling, packed with documents that nobody's touched in decades. Most people find it depressing. I found it empowering. Because buried in those files was information worth more than Victoria's entire subdivision. The original deed transfer from 1752 was written in Spanish, back when Florida was still under Spanish colonial rule. The parchment felt fragile in my gloved hands. The ink faded but still legible. A clerk helped me translate the formal legal language. Most of it was standard property transfer language. But then I reached the section that made my heart stop. Including all water rights, surface and subsurface, to natural spring and creek system and all tributaries thereof. in perpetuity, extending throughout the natural aquifer system underlying said property and adjacent lands. I read it 3 times to make sure I understood. Then I pulled out modern geological surveys of the area. The underground spring system that feeds Silver Run Creek extends 4 miles beneath what is now Sunset Harbor Estates. Every well in that subdivision taps directly into the aquifer system that my ancestors' deed gave us exclusive rights to for 273 years. My family didn't just own the land. We owned the water. All of it. Every drop flowing through that limestone aquifer. Every gallon being pumped by 873 households who had no idea they'd been using someone else's water without permission for 20 years. Water rights nugget in Mani states. Water rights transfer separately from land ownership and must be explicitly conveyed in property deeds. Failure to secure water rights can expose developers and homeowners to massive legal liability and usage fees. The developer who built Sunset Harbor Estates had made a catastrophic error. He'd purchased the land surrounding my property, but never researched whether water rights existed separately. He'd assumed that drilling wells on his land gave him rights to the water beneath it. He was wrong. Expensive mistake. Career-ending oversight. For 20 years, nearly 1,000 families had been using my family's water without permission, compensation, or even knowledge. The back payments alone would be staggering, but combined with Victoria's contamination of that same water system, the legal liability was beyond calculation. I called Maria from the courthouse parking lot, sunshine warming my truck's interior while my world tilted on its axis. Maria, I don't just own Silver Run Creek. I own the entire aquifer system feeding the subdivision. Every drop they've used for 20 years legally belongs to my family. The silence stretched so long I checked my phone to see if the call had dropped. Thomas, she finally whispered, you're not defending against harassment anymore. You're sitting on the biggest water rights case this state has seen in 50 years. And if that contamination spreads through your aquifer, you have grounds for environmental damages that could bankrupt the entire HOA. The math was staggering. Average household water usage times 873 homes times 240 months times market rate for water rights. We were talking tens of millions in back payments I could legally demand. But the contamination damages, those were incalculable federal fees, health monitoring for exposed families, environmental restoration, legal costs, punitive damages. Victoria's lawsuit against me for my kayak dock suddenly looked like an ant threatening an elephant. Her harassment campaign had been annoying. Her environmental terrorism had been criminal, but contaminating an aquifer system that I legally owned, that was catastrophe on a scale that would follow her to prison and beyond. I sat in that parking lot for an hour, watching normal people go about their normal lives. They had no idea what I'd just discovered. No idea that the property rights dispute everyone thought was about a fishing dock was actually about controlling the water supply for 1,000 families. No idea that the HOA president who'd poisoned my creek had just handed me the legal equivalent of a nuclear weapon. But here's the thing about power. How you use it defines who you are. I could destroy 873 innocent families financially just to punish Victoria. I could demand decades of back payments that would bankrupt retirees and young families who'd done nothing wrong except buy homes in the wrong subdivision. I could be exactly the kind of person Victoria accused me of being. Or I could be better. I could use this leverage to force accountability where it belonged, restore the environmental damage, and protect families who were about to discover their drinking water was poisoned. I could turn Victoria's terrorism into lasting change. The decision made itself. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about justice. And justice meant making sure the guilty party paid while protecting the innocent bystanders. Victoria Sterling was about to learn that environmental terrorism has consequences. But she was going to learn it in a way that her lawyer brain never saw coming. While I was discovering my family's water rights, Victoria was spiraling into full panic mode. She'd started noticing something was wrong within days of poisoning my creek. The Sunset Harbor Estates Facebook group suddenly exploded with posts about strange-tasting water. Residents complained about metallic flavor in their coffee. Parents noted their kids weren't drinking enough water because it tasted funny. Someone posted about their dog refusing to drink from its bowl. The comment section became a digital panic room, with hundreds of worried homeowners comparing symptoms. Victoria, being Victoria, immediately went into damage control mode that would make a politician proud. She posted an official HOA statement, claiming the taste was due to natural mineral deposits and seasonal variations in groundwater. Composition. Composition. Translation: nothing to see here. Trust your benevolent dictator. Stop asking inconvenient questions. She even hired a water testing company to provide reassuring reports, carefully selecting a firm that would test for everything except copper sulfate. But desperate people do desperate research. And some residents weren't satisfied with Victoria's explanations. They started having their water independently tested. Within 2 weeks, 3 different families had discovered elevated copper levels. The Facebook panic escalated from worried to furious. Demands for answers. Threats of lawsuits. Questions about why the HOA president was covering up water contamination. That's when Victoria made her second catastrophic mistake. She tried to cover up the original crime. She contacted Derek Paulson at Industrial Water Solutions and attempted to bribe him into destroying service records. She offered him $12,000 cash to lose any documentation of their Midnight Creek treatment. The smell of her desperation could have cleared a building. What Victoria didn't realize was that environmental services companies keep meticulous records specifically because of legal liability. And Derek, having watched enough true crime documentaries to recognize a criminal conspiracy when he saw one, recorded their entire conversation. A panicked woman offering cash bribes at 11 at night to destroy evidence. That's not just suspicious. That's obstruction of justice with a side of felony stupidity. Legal warning. Attempting to destroy evidence or bribe witnesses transforms misdemeanor charges into felony obstruction of justice. The cover-up is often worse than the original crime. Victoria was learning this lesson the hard way. Meanwhile, Victoria also hired a private investigator named Marcus Webb to dig up dirt on me. Webb was the kind of pie who specialized in personal background investigations and looked like he learned his trade from bad television shows. He started following me around Riverside Springs, photographing my truck, talking to my clients, interviewing my suppliers, trying desperately to find something that could discredit me in court. Webb tried breaking into my truck one afternoon at the hardware store. I watched from inside as he attempted the door handles, his cheap suit jacket stretching across his back. I calmly called the police and watched officers arrest him for attempted vehicle burglary. Turns out, Webb had a history of crossing legal boundaries for clients. His PI license was already on probation for previous violations. Victoria's choice of investigator was as poor as her choice of environmental terrorism. But Victoria wasn't finished. She filed anonymous complaints with the state contractor licensing board claiming my solar business operated without proper permits. Complete fabrication. But it triggered an investigation that cost me 3 weeks and $4,000 in legal fees to resolve. The bureaucratic harassment had returned with vengeance. Except this time, I was documenting everything. Every phone call, every complaint. Every instance of her weaponizing government agencies. My attorney Maria was building a harassment case that would make employment lawyers jealous. And then the community health crisis reached critical mass. A pediatrician in Riverside Springs noticed an unusual spike in childhood stomach problems among kids from Sunset Harbor Estates. Parents brought children in with nausea, stomach pain, headaches, symptoms consistent with heavy metal poisoning. The doctor filed a mandatory report with County Health Services. The HOA board started receiving dozens of complaints about water quality. Families were buying bottled water in bulk. Some installed expensive filtration systems. The Facebook group had transformed into a support network for people convinced something was seriously wrong with their water. Property values started dropping as word spread about contamination. Victoria's response was characteristically she called an emergency HOA meeting and announced a special assessment of $650 per household for emergency water system upgrades. She was literally charging people to fix the problem she'd created. The audacity was breathtaking. Part 3. The truth surfaces. The HOA board meeting where Victoria announced her special assessment was packed with over 200 angry homeowners. The Sunset Harbor Community Center smelled like bad coffee and rising panic. Parents held folders thick with medical bills. Retirees demanded answers about contaminated water they'd been drinking for weeks. The atmosphere was electric with justified rage. Victoria stood at the podium in her designer's suit, makeup perfect despite the stress lines creeping around her eyes. She tried maintaining her corporate lawyer voice, but cracks were showing. The special assessment is necessary to address unforeseen water infrastructure challenges. We're taking proactive steps to ensure community health and safety. Unforeseen. A man in the third row stood up, his face red with anger. My daughter's been sick for 3 weeks. Doctors say it's heavy metal poisoning. You knew something was wrong and you covered it up. The room erupted. Accusations flew from every direction. Someone demanded Victoria's resignation. Another threatened legal action. A woman in the back yelled about property values plummeting. The meeting devolved into chaos faster than Victoria could pound her gavel. I watched from the doorway, documenting everything. My attorney Maria stood beside me, taking notes with the precision of someone building a federal case. "This is better than any deposition we could have arranged," she whispered. "She's destroying her own credibility in real time." Board member Patricia Chun finally stood up and demanded order. Her voice cut through the chaos with authority that Victoria's fake composure couldn't match. Patricia was a retired environmental engineer who'd bought into Sunset Harbor, expecting peaceful retirement. Instead, she'd gotten contaminated water and an HOA president who thought lying was a leadership strategy. "I have questions about the special assessment." Patricia sighed, her voice cold enough to freeze the Gulf of Mexico. "Specifically about a $3,800 expense listed as emergency landscaping last month." "Victoria, where are the receipts for that expenditure?" Victoria's face went pale beneath her foundation. "That was routine maintenance approved by the board. I never approved any $3,800 landscaping expense," Patricia countered. "And neither did any other board member I've spoken with. So I'll ask again. Where are the receipts?" The room went silent. 200 homeowners watched Victoria squirm like a fish on my old dock. She opened her mouth several times, but no believable lies emerged. The silence stretched until it became damning. "I have copies of HOA financial records right here," Patricia continued, holding up a folder thick enough to be a weapon. "That $3,800 payment went to Industrial Water Solutions, the same company currently under federal investigation for illegal dumping in protected waterways. Would you like to explain why HOA funds paid for that service?" Victoria's perfect composure shattered completely. She grabbed her briefcase and headed for the door without another word. The murmur that followed her exit sounded like vindication. Patricia Chun had just done what months of my complaints couldn't accomplish. She'd exposed Victoria's crimes to the entire community. But I wasn't done. Neither was Maria. We'd been building something much bigger than a community scandal. We'd been constructing a legal case that would redefine water rights law in Florida, and it was time to spring the trap. 3 days after that disastrous HOA meeting, I held a press conference at my property. Local news stations came because environmental terrorism sells ratings. The Tampa Bay Times sent their investigative reporter. Even a crew from Miami drove up when they heard about water rights worth tens of millions. I stood on my dock with Silver Run Creek flowing behind me, still discolored but slowly recovering. Maria flanked me on one side. Dr. James Chun, a hydrogeologist from University of Florida, on the other. Behind us, printed charts showed the aquifer system connecting my creek to 873 homes. My family has owned this property and its water rights since 17... I began, holding up the original Spanish deed. Every drop of water flowing through Silver Run Creek and the connected aquifer system legally belongs to my family. The developer who built Sunset Harbor Estates never purchased these water rights. For 20 years, nearly 1,000 families have been using water that belongs to me. The reporters started shouting questions immediately. Dr. Chun stepped forward with geological maps showing how the aquifer connected everything. This underground spring system extends 4 miles beneath Sunset Harbor Estates. Every residential well taps directly into the aquifer that Mr. Rivera's family has owned exclusive rights to for 273 years. Water rights? Law nugget. When water rights were established before modern property development, they typically remain with the original deed holder unless explicitly transferred. This creates complex legal situations where property owners may not actually own the water beneath their land. But I'm not here to bankrupt innocent families, I continued. I'm waiving all back payments for water usage. Tens of millions of dollars I could legally demand. I'm waiving it all. But Victoria Sterling, who poisoned my creek and contaminated the aquifer I own, will be held fully accountable. Maria took over then, her voice carrying the weight of legal authority. Mrs. Sterling faces federal environmental terrorism charges, state illegal dumping charges, embezzlement charges for misusing HOA funds, and obstruction of justice for attempting to destroy evidence and bribe witnesses. We have video footage of the dumping, recorded conversations of her bribery attempts, and documentation of her harassment campaign. The questions came faster. How much contamination? When will the water be safe? What about health effects? Will there be criminal trials? What happens to Victoria Sterling? The EPA has issued emergency health advisories. Dr. Chun explained, current copper sulfate levels are 4 times EPA safety standards. We estimate 6 to 8 more weeks before contamination reaches critical levels in residential wells. Immediate bottled water is recommended for all Sunset Harbor residents. The press conference made national news by evening. HOA president poisons neighborhood water supply in property dispute. The story had everything media loves: wealthy suburbs, environmental disaster, legal drama, and a David versus Goliath narrative with me as the wronged property owner who owned the water supply. Victoria's world collapsed faster than a sinkhole in rainy season. The Monroe County Sheriff's Office arrested her 2 days later on multiple felony charges. The footage of her being let out in handcuffs, still wearing designer clothes but looking 20 years older, played on loop across Florida news stations. Her husband Jonathan filed for divorce immediately, taking their 2 kids and citing irreconcilable differences and potential legal liability exposure. Coastal Landscape Management lost every municipal contract within a week. Their business tanked so hard they filed bankruptcy within a month. The Florida Bar Association suspended Victoria's law license pending resolution of criminal charges. Her HOA position was terminated by emergency board vote. Even her country club membership was revoked. In less than 2 weeks, Victoria Sterling went from suburban queen to unemployed criminal defendant, facing decades in prison. But the legal proceedings were just beginning. The EPA filed federal charges for environmental crimes. The state attorney filed charges for illegal dumping and embezzlement. The Monroe County prosecutor added obstruction of justice, and I filed civil suits for property damage, emotional distress, and punitive damages that would ensure Victoria never forgot the cost of environmental terrorism. The neighborhood transformation happened almost overnight. Patricia Chun became HOA president with a mandate to establish transparency and accountability. The board implemented new rules requiring homeowner approval for any expenditure over $500. They established a resident rights committee and replaced Victoria's dictatorship with actual democratic governance. Sunset Harbor residents organized a community support fund for families with medical bills from contamination exposure. They hired independent water testing companies to monitor wells weekly. They created communication channels that didn't involve Facebook panic. The crisis brought neighbors together in ways that suburban life rarely achieves. The environmental recovery plan moved forward faster than anyone expected. The EPA designated Silver Run Creek as a priority restoration site. Federal grants covered most cleanup costs. Dr. Chun designed a bioremediation strategy using natural filtration and water cycling that would restore the ecosystem in 18 to 24 months instead of the originally estimated 3 to 5 years. And then came the settlement offer I'd been waiting for. Victoria's attorney, a desperate man trying to minimize his client's prison time, approached Maria with a proposal. Victoria would plead guilty to all charges in exchange for reduced sentencing. She'd pay for complete creek restoration. She'd establish an environmental education fund. She'd agreed to permanent oversight preventing future HOA abuse. The financial terms were staggering. $200,000 for creek restoration using Dr. Chun's bioremediation plan. $50,000 for the Environmental Education Fund. $25,000 for health monitoring of exposed families, plus court costs, legal fees, and restitution for my lost income during the harassment campaign. But the non-financial terms were even better. Victoria would resign from all community positions permanently. She'd be banned from serving on any HOA board in Florida. She'd provide public testimony about how her harassment escalated to environmental terrorism, creating a documented case study that would be used in property law classes for decades. The settlement protected innocent families from financial ruin while ensuring the guilty party paid every possible consequence. It provided restoration funding without bankrupting the HOA. It created lasting change in how communities handle power-hungry board members, and it turned my family's tragedy into a foundation for environmental protection. 3 months after Victoria's arrest, I stood on my dock at sunrise watching Dr. Chun's team release native fish fingerlings into Silver Run Creek. The water was approaching pre-contamination quality. Copper sulfate levels had dropped below EPA emergency thresholds. Birds were returning to nest in cypress trees. Otters had been spotted playing in recovered pools. Rachel joined me with coffee that tasted like victory and fresh starts. "It's coming back," she said softly. "Everything she tried to destroy is coming back stronger." "Not everything," I corrected. "Victoria's never coming back from this, and that's exactly what she deserves." The county was prosecuting her crimes with the enthusiasm of officials who rarely get such clear-cut cases of environmental terrorism. Federal sentencing guidelines suggested 3 to 5 years minimum. State charges could add another 2 to 4 years. Civil judgments would bankrupt her completely. Her legal career was finished. Her marriage was over. Her reputation was destroyed beyond repair. And every single consequence was the direct result of her own choices. She could have left me alone. She could have respected property rights that predated her subdivision by 2.5 centuries. She could have handled her petty grievances like a rational adult instead of a power-drunk tyrant. Instead, she chose harassment. She chose terrorism. She chose to poison an entire community's water supply rather than tolerate her neighbor running kayak tours. And those choices followed her straight to a prison cell. The preliminary hearings were spectacular theater. Victoria's defense attorney tried every tactic imaginable. He claimed environmental testing was flawed. He suggested the contamination came from unknown sources. He even attempted to argue that Victoria had been acting in good faith to address a legitimate algae problem. The judge shut him down faster than a summer squall. Your honor. The prosecution has video evidence of industrial water solutions dumping chemicals at 2:23 in the morning, the assistant district attorney countered. They have Ms. Sterling's payment records. They have recorded conversations where she attempted to bribe witnesses. They have testimony from the company owner confirming she misrepresented the situation. This wasn't good faith. This was calculated environmental assault. The evidence was overwhelming. Security footage showed everything. Financial records proved she'd used HOA funds without authorization. Derek Polson's recorded phone conversations captured her bribery attempts. My documentation showed years of escalating harassment, and the water testing results proved the scale of contamination she'd caused. Victoria's bail was set at $250,000. Her parents had to mortgage their retirement home to post it. She was fitted with electronic monitoring and forbidden from leaving Monroe County. The judge's warning was crystal clear. Any attempt to contact witnesses or influence the investigation will result in immediate revocation of bail. But Victoria, being Victoria, couldn't help herself. She created a fake Facebook account and started posting in Sunset Harbor community groups. She claimed she was being framed. She suggested I'd contaminated my own creek for insurance fraud. She even implied the EPA was conspiring against her because of political connections I allegedly had. The desperation was pathetic. Her fake account lasted 4 days before residents figured out it was her. Screenshots went straight to prosecutors. The judge revoked her bail immediately and sent her to county jail to await trial. Turns out violating court orders about witness contact is taken seriously. Who knew? Legal warning. When facing criminal charges, any attempt to influence public opinion, contact witnesses, or manipulate evidence will be used against you in court and typically results in harsher sentencing. Defense attorneys exist for a reason. Listen to them. The community response to her jailing was telling. Nobody organized protests demanding her release. Nobody started petitions claiming injustice. Instead, Sunset Harbor residents organized celebration barbecues. Property values started recovering. The Facebook groups shifted from panic about water to planning neighborhood improvement projects. I received thank you cards from families who'd been buying bottled water for weeks. Parents whose kids had gotten sick sent notes expressing gratitude that I'd exposed the contamination source. Even some residents who'd initially believed Victoria's propaganda about me apologized for judging too quickly. The environmental education program launched ahead of schedule. Local schools brought fourth graders to Silveroon Creek to learn about aquatic ecosystems, the importance of water rights, and consequences of environmental crimes. I led tours explaining how spring-fed creeks work, why chemical contamination is so dangerous, and how communities can protect natural resources. Kids ask questions their parents probably wished they wouldn't. Did the bad lady really poison all the fish? Is she going to jail forever? Can we drink the water again? I answered honestly, age-appropriately, and with emphasis on how their generation could prevent similar disasters through understanding environmental law and respecting property rights. Dr. Chun's restoration timeline was accelerating beautifully. Monthly water tests showed copper sulfate levels dropping faster than predicted. Native vegetation was recovering along the creek banks. Fish populations were rebounding. The cypress trees that had looked sick and dying were showing new growth. Nature heals when you give it the chance. But the legal process ground forward with bureaucratic slowness. Victoria's trial date was set for 8 months out. The prosecution was building an airtight case using every piece of evidence we'd collected. Federal environmental crimes, state illegal dumping charges, embezzlement, obstruction of justice. Each charge carried substantial prison time. Her defense attorney tried negotiating better plea deals. The prosecution wasn't interested. They had video evidence, recorded confessions, financial documentation, expert testimony, and a community of nearly 1,000 victims. This was a prosecutor's dream case, and they intended to make an example that would echo through Florida environmental law for decades. Meanwhile, the civil suits were progressing faster. My lawsuit against Victoria for property damage and emotional distress was heading toward summary judgment. Her assets were being inventoried for potential seizure. Her house in Sunset Harbor was already listed for sale to cover legal fees. She was discovering that environmental terrorism is expensive in every possible way. The twist came 4 months after her arrest. Victoria's attorney approached Maria with a revised settlement offer. Victoria would plead guilty to everything. She'd provide complete cooperation with ongoing investigations. She'd agree to 5 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years probation. And she'd sell everything she owned to fund creek restoration and community restitution. In exchange, prosecutors would recommend the minimum sentences run concurrently rather than consecutively. She'd serve 5 years instead of potentially 15. It was still substantial prison time, but it would let her out before she was 60, young enough to maybe rebuild some kind of life, old enough to never forget the cost of her choices. Maria brought me the offer. Thomas, this gets everything we wanted. Full accountability, complete restoration funding, a legal precedent that will protect property rights for decades, and Victoria serves real prison time. The only difference is whether she serves 5 years or 15. I thought about it for 2 days. I thought about my dead creek. I thought about families drinking poisoned water. I thought about the kids who got sick. I thought about 273 years of family heritage that Victoria tried to destroy. And I thought about what justice really means. Part 4. Justice flows. 5 years in prison. That was my answer. Victoria Sterling would serve 5 years in federal prison for environmental terrorism, followed by 5 years of probation with strict environmental monitoring requirements. She'd pay full restitution. She'd fund the creek restoration completely, and she'd spend the rest of her life knowing that her moment of petty vindictiveness cost her everything. The plea hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in Tampa Federal Courthouse. The building smells like marble and justice, if justice smelled like recycled air conditioning and nervous lawyers. I sat in the gallery with Rachel, Maria, and Patricia Chun. Behind us sat dozens of Sunset Harbor residents who'd driven hours to watch Victoria admit her crimes. Victoria entered the courtroom wearing an orange Monroe County Jail jumpsuit, hands shackled, looking nothing like the powerful HOA president who'd terrorized me for a year. Her hair had gone gray at the roots. Her face showed every one of her 45 years plus another decade of stress. The transformation from suburban queen to convicted felon was complete. Judge Margaret Thompson presided with the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd seen every possible criminal excuse and believed none of them. She reviewed the plea agreement carefully, asking questions that made Victoria's attorney sweat through his expensive suit. "This is a serious set of charges, Mrs. Sterling. Do you understand you're pleading guilty to federal environmental terrorism, state illegal dumping, embezzlement, and obstruction of justice?" Victoria's voice was barely audible. "Yes, Your Honor. And you understand that this plea agreement requires you to allocate, meaning you must describe exactly what you did and why." "Yes, Your Honor." "Then proceed." Victoria's allocation was excruciating to watch. She described contacting Industrial Water Solutions and lying about an algae problem. She admitted using HOA funds, without authorization, to pay for the chemical dumping. She confessed to attempting to bribe Derek Paulson to destroy records. She acknowledged the harassment campaign she'd waged against me for over a year. But the worst part was her reason why. I couldn't stand watching him run his kayak business on what I considered community waterfront property. I thought if I made his life difficult enough, he'd sell and leave. When legal harassment didn't work, I escalated to environmental action without considering the consequences. Environmental action. That's what she called poisoning a 273-year-old creek and contaminating drinking water for nearly 1,000 people. Environmental action, the euphemism, was almost as offensive as the crime. Judge Thompson wasn't impressed. "Mrs. Sterling, you poisoned an entire neighborhood's water supply because you didn't like your neighbor running kayak tours. That's not environmental action. That's environmental terrorism driven by petty vindictiveness." The judge continued, "You used your position of power as HOA president to wage a harassment campaign. You misappropriated community funds. You committed federal crimes. You attempted to destroy evidence and bribe witnesses. And when caught, your first instinct was to lie and deflect responsibility. This court accepts your guilty plea, and I want to be clear. You're receiving leniency only because you're providing full restitution and cooperation. Don't mistake this court's mercy for approval." Sentencing was set for 6 weeks later. Victoria was remanded back to county jail until then. As they led her away in shackles, she looked back at the gallery. Our eyes met for just a moment. I saw no remorse there. Just anger and resentment that she'd been caught and held accountable. Some people never learn. The sentencing hearing drew even more attention. National media showed up after the story went viral. HOA president poisoned neighborhood to stop kayak tours had become a cautionary tale shared across social media. Property rights activists cited it as an example of HOA overreach. Environmental groups used it to illustrate the consequences of illegal dumping. Law professors assigned it as a case study in how personal vendettas escalate to federal crimes. Judge Thompson imposed the agreed-upon sentence: 5 years in federal prison, 5 years probation, full financial restitution, permanent ban from HOA service, mandatory environmental education speaking engagements after release, and ongoing water quality monitoring at her expense. But the judge added something unexpected. "Mrs. Sterling, I'm also ordering you to write a public letter of apology to every family affected by your actions." Not a generic statement. Individual letters to 873 households explaining what you did and accepting responsibility. You'll also fund scholarships for environmental law students studying water rights protection, The gallery erupted in applause. The judge banged her gavel but smiled slightly. "Order! This is still a courtroom. But yes, justice has been served." Victoria was transferred to Federal Correctional Institution in Tallahassee the following week. Medium security, 5 hours from Riverside Springs. Her visiting list was short. Her parents and her attorney. Jonathan had refused all contact. Her children were too young and too traumatized to visit a parent in federal prison. The isolation was part of the punishment. Meanwhile, Silver Run Creek's restoration accelerated beyond expectations. Dr. Chun's bioremediation strategy worked beautifully. Natural filtration through limestone formations combined with strategic water cycling reduced copper sulfate levels faster than predicted. Within 8 months, EPA testing showed contamination below actionable thresholds. The fish returned first. Not the native population that Victoria killed, but new fingerlings introduced through the restoration program. Bass, bluegill, catfish. They thrived in water that had been death just months before. Then came the birds, herons, egrets, ospreys. The cypress trees recovered their green vibrancy. Otters moved back into the restored habitat. I ran my first kayak tour in 14 months on a Saturday morning that felt like rebirth. The water was clear again, flowing over limestone rocks that had witnessed 273 years of family history. The air smelled like jasmine and salt water and new beginnings. My clients included 3 families from Sunset Harbor Estates, neighbors who'd never considered kayaking until the contamination crisis brought us together. One guest, a teenager named Emma whose family had drunk contaminated water for weeks, asked me a question as we paddled through a cypress corridor. "Do you hate Mrs. Sterling?" I thought about it before answering. I hate what she did. I hate that she poisoned this creek and endangered families. But hate isn't what changed anything. Understanding property rights changed things. Documenting evidence changed things. Using the legal system properly changed things. Victoria's in prison not because I hated her, but because she committed crimes and got caught. Emma nodded thoughtfully. "My mom says we should be grateful to you for exposing the contamination before anyone got really sick." "I'm grateful your mom's okay, and I hope you never take clean water for granted." The environmental education program exceeded every expectation. Schools from 3 counties brought students to Silver Run Creek. We'd built a small outdoor classroom on my property, funded by Victoria's restitution payments. Kids learned about aquatic ecosystems, water rights law, environmental protection, and civic responsibility. The program's most popular component was the criminal case study. Students reviewed redacted court documents, watched security footage of the dumping, analyzed water contamination data, and discussed how one person's vendetta escalated to federal crimes. The lesson wasn't just about Victoria's mistakes. It was about power, accountability, and the importance of protecting shared resources. Sunset Harbor Estates transformed completely. Patricia Chun's HOA board implemented radical transparency. Monthly financial reports were posted online. Major decisions required homeowner votes. Board meetings became community events instead of rubber stamp sessions. The dictatorship Victoria built was replaced by actual democracy. Property values recovered fully within 18 months. Potential buyers who'd fled during the contamination crisis returned when EPA declared the water safe. Real estate agents marketed Sunset Harbor as a community that had faced environmental disaster and emerged stronger. The crisis became a selling point. A neighborhood that holds leaders accountable and protects shared resources. The legal precedents set by Victoria's case rippled through Florida property law. 3 appellate court decisions cited it in water rights disputes. State legislature introduced HOA reform bills inspired by the case. Environmental law professors assigned it to students studying the intersection of property rights and environmental protection. Victoria's criminal conviction became a teaching tool for future generations. My family's water rights were formally codified in updated county records. The aquifer system beneath Sunset Harbor Estates was legally recognized as my property. But I negotiated permanent easements, allowing residential use in exchange for ongoing environmental protection requirements. Homeowners could access the water they needed while ensuring the aquifer remained protected from future Victoria's water rights legal framework. Establishing formal easements protects both property owners and water users. Written agreements prevent future disputes while ensuring environmental stewardship. This approach balances individual property rights with community needs and environmental protection. 2 years after Victoria's sentencing, I received an unexpected letter, prison stationery. Her handwriting, I almost threw it away unread. But curiosity won. The letter was short, no apology, which would have been insulting this late, just acknowledgement. I destroyed everything, trying to force you off land you'd owned for centuries. I poisoned my own neighborhood's water because I couldn't tolerate your kayak tours. I lost my marriage, my career, my freedom, and my reputation. You were right about everything, and I was wrong about everything. I'll spend the rest of my life knowing that my vindictiveness cost me everything while you kept everything I tried to take. That's the only justice I understand now. I showed the letter to Rachel. She read it and shrugged. Too little, too late. But at least she finally understands. I filed the letter with all the other documentation from the case. Someday, historians or law students might find it useful. The psychology of how intelligent people make catastrophically stupid decisions is worth studying. Victoria had every advantage: education, wealth, legal knowledge, and she threw it all away because she couldn't stand her neighbor running a business that predated her subdivision by 200 years. 3 years post-sentencing, Silver Run Creek was fully restored. EPA removed it from the contaminated sites list. Federal grants funded ongoing monitoring for another 5 years, but projections showed the ecosystem had recovered completely. Native fish populations were thriving. Water quality exceeded pre-contamination levels. The creek my grandfather taught me to respect was flowing clean again. I expanded my kayak tour business to include environmental education components. Clients learned about water rights, ecosystem protection, and the importance of civic engagement. Tour revenue funded scholarships for local students interested in environmental science. Victoria's restitution payments created something positive from her crimes. Sunset Harbor Estates hosted an annual Creek Restoration Festival celebrating the community's recovery. Families gathered at the waterfront to appreciate the ecosystem Victoria tried to destroy. Local musicians performed, food vendors sold out. Kids learned to identify native species. The event became a symbol of community resilience and environmental stewardship. At the 3rd annual festival, Patricia Chun gave a speech that captured everything we'd learned. 3 years ago, our neighborhood faced environmental catastrophe caused by one person's abuse of power. We could have fractured. We could have blamed each other. Instead, we came together. We held our leader accountable. We protected our shared resources. We created systems ensuring this never happens again. That's the real victory. The crowd cheered. Hundreds of neighbors who'd been strangers before the crisis were now a community united by shared trauma and shared recovery. Victoria had tried to divide us. Instead, she brought us together in ways suburban developments rarely achieve. 4 years after Victoria's sentencing, her release date approached. She'd served her time with model behavior, taught environmental law classes to other inmates, and fulfilled every requirement of her plea agreement. The Florida bar confirmed her legal license would never be reinstated. Her future looked nothing like the powerful attorney and HOA president she'd been. I received a notification that she'd listed me as someone she might contact after release. Probation requirements meant she couldn't approach me without permission. I declined. There was nothing she could say that would change anything. The creek was restored. The community was thriving. Justice had been served. Her apology, or lack thereof, was irrelevant to the life I'd rebuilt. 5 years after she poisoned my creek, Victoria Sterling walked out of federal prison into a world that had moved on without her. Her ex-husband had her children were teenagers who barely knew her. Sunset Harbor Estates had prospered under new leadership. Silver Run Creek flowed clean and clear, supporting ecosystems she'd tried to destroy. I heard she moved to Georgia, took a job as a paralegal, and lived quietly in an apartment that cost less than her old monthly country club dues. Her name occasionally appeared in property law textbooks as a cautionary example. Students studied her case to understand how not to handle neighborhood disputes. Her legacy was complete failure. Meanwhile, my legacy was a restored creek, a thriving business, a stronger community, and legal precedents protecting water rights for future generations. My grandfather would have been proud. My father would have approved, and 273 years of family stewardship continued because I'd stood my ground against a tyrant who thought power meant more than property rights. The final chapter of this story belongs not to Victoria's downfall, but to what rose from the ashes of her crimes. Silver Run Creek became a model for environmental restoration projects across the Southeast. Universities brought graduate students to study the bioremediation techniques that had worked so effectively. The EPA featured it in training materials for contamination response teams. My kayak business expanded to 3 guides and 12 boats. We ran tours 6 days a week, teaching thousands of people annually about water ecosystems and environmental stewardship. Former Sunset Harbor residents became regular clients, bringing friends and family to experience the creek that had almost been lost to one person's vendetta. So here's what I learned from the woman who tried to destroy everything I loved. Document everything. Know your rights. Use the legal system properly. Protect your property with knowledge and evidence, not anger. And understand that justice isn't about revenge. It's about accountability, restoration, and creating systems that prevent future abuses. If you're facing an HOA nightmare, a property dispute, or someone weaponizing power against you, remember this story. Victoria Sterling had wealth, education, legal expertise, and community authority. I had property rights, documentation, patience, and determination. She's in the legal textbooks as an example of failure. I'm still running kayak tours on crystal clear water that my family has owned for nearly 3 centuries. Your property rights are worth defending. Your community's resources are worth protecting. And tyrants who think power overrides law are worth defeating through proper legal channels. The system works when citizens understand their rights, document violations, and pursue accountability through appropriate means. Thanks for following this journey. Remember that communities are stronger than dictators. Truth is more powerful than corruption. And sometimes standing your ground changes everything. Protect what's yours, respect what's shared, and never let fear of powerful neighbors prevent you from defending legitimate rights. The law exists to protect all of us, not just those with the loudest voices or the biggest bank accounts.